Te Marianna Nunn. I was born here in Albuquerque, the daughter of Latin Americanists. My parents are professors. My father's a Chilean historian, a Latin American historian, and my mother is a Chicana literary critic. And so I was kind of born into this field, and my parents laugh because they say that I hated churches and museums when I was little, and now it's come back full circle. I had a brief stint, as they call it, in my rebellion in retail management, and then went back to graduate school with a bachelor's degree in anthropology and then master's and PhD in Latin American studies here at the University of New Mexico. And I did my master's thesis on the image of Santo Niño de Atocha from Zacatecas, and also he's another image who's very important, connected to the Franciscans, and very important in New Mexico. And then my dissertation, my PhD work, was I'd always been really fascinated by the 30s and the 40s and what was happening in Mexico in regards to arts and also in regards to popular culture. But I wanted to find some connection given how New Mexican artists have been treated, Nuevo Mexicano artists have been treated in art history. They're basically missing, from art history books. And especially when you know of all the Anglo artists here in New Mexico who have achieved great fame by living here. So my graduate work, my PhD, was on recovering the Hispana and Hispano artists of the New Deal era in New Mexico, the WPA artists, because there were hundreds of them, and they had been basically left out of all the art history books, and that includes muralists and painters and tin artists and straw applique artists and colcheras and all sorts of things. But they had been left out of art history because they were treated as craftspeople, even the painters and the muralists. So it was a big recovery project. And one of my first exhibits at the Folk Art Museum was sort of recovering their names and reinserting them and inviting all the families. And we would use the Santa Fe phone book and call up and go, were you related to, once we found a name, could you be related to Eliseo Rodriguez? And people would be like, oh yes, So we were able to do a big thing there that became very important to New Mexico. So that project was called Sin Nombre, because they had been without name, but then we were able to reinsert them. I have always liked stuff, so I think that's where my interest is in material culture, but I also like the stories behind stuff. So, my area of specialization is New Mexican artists, but also Latino, Chicano, and Hispanic artists. And I worked for almost 10 years as the curator of contemporary Hispano and Latino collections at the Museum of International Folk Art up in Santa Fe. And then have been here at the National Hispanic Cultural Center as the director of the Art Museum since fall 2006. The National Hispanic Cultural Center really came out, we officially opened in 2013, in October 2013. And the center is comprised of an art museum, a history and literary arts program, a major theater complex, the Roy E. Disney Performing Arts Center, and an education center. And it arose from, as most cultural specific institutions did, the idea rose in the late 60s, 70s, 80s, organized by artists and writers and performers here in Albuquerque and in New Mexico. And then the business people and the politicians took over, but the idea, the seed for the idea was originally to have a place of our own, as most ethnic specific centers happened. And so that idea finally came to fruition in 2013 with buildings. There had been, working out of offices and things before then. But as I said, we originally opened in 2013. And it was a really interesting metamorphosis. It started out as the Hispanic Cultural Center of New Mexico, and then we got some federal funding, and so it became the National Hispanic Cultural Center of New Mexico. And then they dropped the New Mexico part. So it became the National Hispanic Cultural Center. And through that, as with any cultural space, there's been mystery and intrigue and politics and contention as to whose space is it and who were the founders and those sorts of those sorts of things. For a very long time, the visual artists and many other writers and performers felt quite left out of the center when we first opened. I wasn't here for the beginning part, but in hearing that, they felt like they had been behind the idea and among the founders, and then were sort of left out of the initial programming. So one of the responses that we had when I took the helm as director was to create a community gallery that was always New Mexican artists. And the support for the community gallery, which the San Pascual exhibit is in, is really incredible, and they're our largest openings when we have them at the museum, with hundreds of people and their families, and people actually feeling like they have a space, because it's a very interesting dynamic in New Mexico that even though there's the tricultural myth of Anglo and Hispano and Native American, when you look at and a huge amount of museums, when you look at the number of museums that actually show Hispano, Chicano, Nuevo Mexicano, Latino, Latin American art, it's very few, and the exhibits are very few and far between. So it's really important in this space that not only with our mission in the Art Museum at the National Hispanic Cultural Center, which is broad and represents the whole Spanish, Portuguese diaspora, that we make sure that there's a place for the thousands of artists that we have in New Mexico too. You know, I've studied them for quite some time now, and I'm so fascinated with how the artists push, how they're able to adapt and push the boundaries of what those ideas of tradition are or have been stated on paper. There's a lot of interesting things happening now in Spanish Market. Many artists generated, you know, for a very long time, the board of Spanish Market and the Spanish Colonial Art Society had no artists on it. The decisions were always made by non-artists. And the artists used to tell me, you know, it's because the board is all Anglo. And I used to say, counteract that by saying, I actually think it's because the board is not made, doesn't have any artists to be able to have a voice in what decision making is going on. So in the last 10 years that has changed, and there's still a struggle. I think there's always, you know, always a struggle, and certainly identity issues play a really big part in this in New Mexico and elsewhere, in Latino and Chicano and Hispano communities. But a couple of interesting categories have been introduced. One is called innovation within the tradition. It's a category that the artists have to jury into, but you'll see a lot of the artists who have juried into that category in this exhibit, not all, in which they get to take that story of San Pascual or San Isidro and maybe recontextualize it, maybe make it make him wear, we have a piece here where San Pascual's wearing jeans. That does not reference the Franciscan order, but it makes it contemporary and in 21st century, and there's San Pascual in his kitchen cooking in jeans. It doesn't make him less religious, but it makes him much more approachable. So, you know, I think the necessary path for the artists in the future will be to stretch those boundaries and have those images directly related to what we go through in the present day and to be accessible in the present day. But it doesn't mean it's not a difficult movement or path to take, because there's still a lot of people who are very traditional in their thinking and wouldn't want their saints to change. But I think that the artists that I know, they may have their work that they sell for Spanish Market, but they're always working on something else. They always have something else that they really want to do, sketches that they really want to do, somehow that, you know, that real need to be creative and true to yourself as an artist is always there. And so that's what I always worry about, stereotyping the artists and people only being able to do one thing and have to do it over and over and over and over and over again. But you know, I think they just can't help. I think they can't help themselves, and that's the fascinating part too, to watch and see it unfold and see it play out. I also see an interesting sort of global trend in which it's not so much necessarily that the artists are depicting saints that are popular in New Mexico, but they're learning about other saints, they're reading about other saints, they're seeing an image in a European history book or something about another saint that may not have been popular, may not have come up the Camino Real, may not have been dispersed here, but has, and here I'm going to forget like specific names, but a patron saint of AIDS or a patron saint of breast cancer, or those sorts of things that are reflecting contemporary times right now, but may not have been a traditional image in New Mexico. And so those images are getting made and sold and collected rapidly. And so I found that really interesting to watch the sort of, you know, it's not that we weren't always global because we had Spanish influence, but looking at other saints and what they cure and what they are there for, and sort of the I don't want to say reclamation of those saints or the appropriation of those saints, but the incorporation of those images into sort of the canon of images that people already are familiar with. It's been an interesting trend to watch, and it's just sort of starting. Kateri, the Native American saint, has become very popular since she was canonized. So it's the Hispana and Hispano Nuevo Mexicano artists creating this image that is popular, is a multicultural sort of perspective. So those are the things I'm sort of alluding to or addressing, but I find that sort of opening up of an even more global, because I keep on saying it's not global, we were always global, but that's going to be an interesting trend to watch. And there are a lot of collaborations. We're just not even talking about the Santeros who work in wood and paint, but there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in straw applique. Straw applique has just, I don't want to say blown up, but it has just expanded like you wouldn't believe. It used to be very traditional. You know, it was a colonial art form that was never narrative. Then it became narrative during the WPA with Eliseo Rodriguez, so there started to be scenes and figures. But it was always gold straw because it was supposed to be poor man's gold. It was supposed to shimmer like gold in the churches. But now the artists are getting colored flora of different kinds from New Mexico, so they'll be able to tell you this is a something berry, or this is a something grass that I can only find up in Taos, or something like that. So color is being put in, natural color is being put in to straw, and just completely changing the art form. Tin is completely changing and transforming from traditional designs to designs that are incorporating on contemporary things. Colcha, embroidery, and weaving, you know, is number one, no longer women's work completely. Men are doing it too and creating incredible things, but really has transformed from a very traditional design motifs into contemporary references and stories and interesting things going on. So the whole, you know, body of what is considered traditional New Mexican folk art or artwork, and I hate those terms, but is really, you know, really transforming in the 21st century, and it's going to be really interesting to watch. And for me, it's all, you know, it's really all fine art, and I have problems with those terms when people just dismiss it as folk art, just because, as we mentioned, when people are using traditional materials and maybe referencing the past, but certainly, you know, looking out to the future and seeing what's going on and referencing contemporary times. So in a couple hundred years, when museum curators are looking at this stuff, we'll see a major growth period, I think, a major time of change that kind of, you know, span the 20th and 21st centuries. She's one of the most spiritual people I have ever met in my life. When she tells the story of opening up that motherboard, when she opened up her computer, I'm sure you've heard this story, where she was trying to fix her computer and looked it up and saw the colors, and you just feel like this was some sort of artistic awakening by the way she talks about the colors and the magic and the power of those computer parts. When she creates her works, And she will intentionally use the motherboards to create Marian images. And I think that's fascinating. Her series of Matachinas dancers, in which she references her Pueblo connections and her indigenous connections and the Spanish connections. And, you know, we have a piece here in the permanent gallery which depicts a Matachin dance in which they were all young women, in which the men of the community, the uncles and the fathers, were teaching the young women so that the tradition wouldn't get lost. She only saw it ever performed once and created that piece about it. I have a piece that she made for me that is called Mi Casita, and it's Santo Niño going home after a really long day of performing miracles. So he's going into his bedroom, and so he's got his hat, there's this little chair, and he's got his hat, and he's got his staff with the gourd, and he's putting that down, and then there's a baseball bat and a baseball. There's a baseball hat on a little shelf, a Game Boy, that dates us, so that was like 2000 something or maybe before, a little Game Boy, I mean this piece is only like this, a little Game Boy and a Star Trek pin. And the Star Trek pin comes out and it interchanges with his shell pin. Neat. I remember Marianna was one of the first people to get, what do you call it, Bluetooth? That she would wear on her thing at market. I mean, she's such a gadget girl. But so traditional, you know? And why, you know, why, I mean, the thing is, why do you have to be one or the other? Why can't you be both? San Pascual is a very interesting guy. He's canonized in 1690, but doesn't really appear in the Americas until much later, sometime in the 1700s, late 1700s. In the research I've done, which is not by any means exhaustive, but I think there's a church in Puebla that gets built mid to late 1700s named for him. So there's a santuario for him in Puebla. And then he doesn't really get popular. He's very popular in New Mexico now, but what we've been able to at least figure out so far is he's not really popular until the first part of the 20th century in New Mexico. And I haven't been able to find any extant examples of images of San Pascual. Now there may be some lithographs from Mexico or some prints from Mexico, but there aren't any in the churches. In the reredos, or the altar screens in the churches. There aren't any churches named for him in New Mexico. There aren't any examples of retablos or bultos from the colonial period in the museum collections, unless there are some featuring him as a shepherd, which may be, and they also may have been misidentified as another saint, perhaps, because the story of him as a shepherd isn't really well known or told often. First, I think one of the reasons why he's so popular in New Mexico is that he is Franciscan, and so there's some memory there of Franciscan imagery. And we have a lot of other Franciscan saints that are very popular in New Mexico. But so he, in his basic depiction, he references that. So there's, with his robe, whether it's blue or brown. So there's a familiarity there for the artists creating him and the collectors who are buying him. They're like, oh, you know, that's a saint, and it's a New Mexican saint, okay, you know, and a Franciscan. So I think there's a comfort level there in that. Beyond that, not that many people know his story, except that he's the kitchen saint. So there's a disconnect in the popularity of the image as a religious image, and then it goes right into the fact that he's the kitchen saint, and isn't he cute, and he's happy, and he's cooking food, and he's drinking wine, and he usually has a cat with him, but sometimes a dog or a mouse, and then he becomes approachable in popular culture. What they forget then in that popular memory of him is that when he transitions from a shepherd saint, which is his first job, and the joke is that he didn't do that very well because he was always praying and the sheep ran amok in the fields, and so then he was put into the kitchen to cook because he wasn't minding the sheep very well. But that connection of food and the Eucharist and the symbol of the communion wafer and the wine and how that goes into the kitchen. So I think that's a really interesting link that people say, oh, he's the kitchen saint, but he's the patron saint of the Eucharist and Eucharistic congresses. So that's the the blood and the body of Christ in a food form. Here in New Mexico, the wafer and the idea of the Eucharist gets translated into tortillas. So there's a deep connection there that I think has just gotten forgotten in the popular memory. So now he's become completely accessible, but you see that there's a religious connection. So he doesn't get really popular here until the tourist period in New Mexico, and that sort of starts with the Fred Harvey houses because an image of him is put on a menu. And then he gets really sort of popular at the beginning of Santa Fe style in the 70s, where artists are making him up in Santa Fe, putting him on spoons and little pieces that are sold through the tourist shops and some of the church shops too, which is kind of interesting. But a lot of people who have lived in Santa Fe since the 70s remember that every kitchen, according to them, every kitchen had a San Pascual in the home. So does that correspond with the rise of Santa Fe style and Santa Fe flavors and kitchens in Santa Fe? Is he popular to tourists because he's not necessarily, while he's a Catholic image, he's not overtly Catholic, so people from the East Coast are taking him home because he's a kitchen saint? It's kind of when gourmet food gets big. So I think there's a lot of reasons why he may have risen in popularity. But the really interesting thing is he's so beloved in New Mexico now, in all households, in Native households, Anglo households, Hispano households, any other community where people have him hanging in their kitchens. But he wasn't necessarily in the late 1900s. So it's an interesting dynamic that we haven't fully fleshed out. I think it's one of the reasons why he is approachable, and he's not a Marian figure or an image of Christ. He has a little backstory going on that's approachable and accessible to a wider range of people. But I think it has something to do with corresponding with gourmet foods and the rise of interest in culinary things in the Southwest in general or something, and the spread of that nationally. So I think there's something there to look at. En la Cocina with San Pascual, we came up with that name, first of all, because it sounded like a cooking show. We thought, wouldn't it be cool to do a mock cooking show? En la Cocina with San Pascual. It came about, the idea has been kind of in the back of my brain as the curator for 3 or 4 years, I think. When I first started noticing that the Artisan Spanish Market here, which is held the summer market's last weekend every July up in Santa Fe, when the Spanish market artists were sort of pressing the boundaries of what the traditional rules and regulations are for Spanish market. And I started noticing that with San Pascual, even though he might always be featured as a Franciscan in a blue or a brown robe and with his tonsure, and there he was front and center in the retablos, that what was going on in the background was really interesting in the way the artists were depicting the kitchen, his cooking, his food, his pots, his wine, his animals, the decor back there. And so I kind of wanted to explore that in a way to sort of widen the perception of what traditional New Mexican art is and how creative the artists are. Because one of the comments I often hear about Spanish market is that everything looks the same. And my response is always that you're not looking close enough. So in sort of looking at this, and I would just see very funny things going on or very direct things about New Mexican identity, Nuevo Mexicano identity, the sense of place here, how important New Mexican kitchens are, how important New Mexican food is. And so started noticing that in the works by the artists, and just thought it would be an interesting show to take one saint and really explore what was it that Paul Harvey used to say, the rest of the story, that he might be recognizable, but people don't know the story of San Pascual. They might know that he's the kitchen saint, but they don't know really where he came from. So, and he's a hugely popular saint in New Mexico, and most kitchens and most restaurants have one. And at one point we were going to do a treasure hunt or a scavenger hunt, and see if we could get all the restaurants involved and seen it, because you might not pay attention right away, but then you're like, oh, Baralas Coffee House will have one across the street or somebody. So, he's supposed to help people cook. I know he's helped me learn to cook, so what can I say? First of all, I want them to be able to recognize and know the story of San Pascual, but the whole story. So before he was the patron saint of kitchens, to know that there's much more to that, and how the dispersal of an image or the cult of a saint sort of happens, that he was Spanish and came up through Mexico and up to New Mexico, and those connections, but also how the image and the story will change with time to fit popular needs or current needs or political needs or church needs. I think it's important to know the story of the saints. I think those things kind of get forgotten, and just how they might have become popular in the consciousness of New Mexicans and cooks, and as I mentioned, even Julia Child, who had one in her kitchen. And secondly, and maybe more importantly for me, is to realize the artist's creativity, the innate need to create and push boundaries that New Mexican artists have, especially when they're working under these rules that were established in the 1920s by the Spanish Colonial Art Society as to what was traditional and what artists could do and couldn't do. I think one of the interesting things about their images of San Pascual is that this is where they really kind of push the boundaries and they get away with it. And I find that fascinating, and I think it's a natural need for artists, but here is where they really are able to succeed at it and have fun with it. And I think that's one of the reasons why he's so beloved, is because people sort of get that there's a playfulness or something, some sort of fun aspect about San Pascual. So I hope people learn about San Pascual, who he was, who he is, why he's so important, how he transformed, and what the symbolic connections are, the Eucharist and tortillas, for instance. But also to really realize that in this case, New Mexican artists, take this one image and this one story and do so many incredible things, and really do push the boundaries. So not all the pieces look alike. I think that San Pascual is a perfect example of how the artists are bridging the past and the present and the future. It's interesting, each exhibition has a different audience, but I think this has actually been a hugely popular exhibit. And first it was the artists and their families, obviously, and their collectors, who were the initial audience. But it's gotten some really good press, and I think most recently in New Mexico Magazine named it. And with the popularity of culinary, farm-to-table, cooking shows, there's a lot of cooking shows. The Folk Art Museum had, what was it called? Chocolate, Mate y Mas, an exhibit all about Latin American foods and the importance of it. And there's a lot of focus on organic foods and natural foods and farm foods and everything. So I kept on thinking, well, I would think that doing a show on San Pascual would dovetail into that work. So we've had a lot of cooks, a lot of restaurants, a lot of food writers. We had a food photographer from Chicago come. So it's a very New Mexican show with a very sort of global interest story behind it, I think. One is that there are often angels, and part of his story is that the angels would do the cooking so that he would have time to pray. So you will see the angels in different guises, sometimes very overtly they're actually doing the cooking, sometimes maybe floating about, sometimes depicted as a California Angels baseball hat, but there's always a reference that the angels are, but all of those are all references that the angels were helping him. That's part of his legend, his stories, that they were taking some of the cooking chores off of him so that he would have time to pray. A kitchen cat is very popular, although, as I said, there are dogs and mice in the kitchens. But you know, certainly in medieval times, in previous centuries, a kitchen cat, people had kitchen cats because they would eat the mice so that the mice wouldn't eat the flour and the bread and the grains and the things like that. So that's interesting because it's a very old reference. And here everybody goes, oh, look, he's got a kitchen cat. But it is a very old religious, not a religious, but a very old artistic reference, and a very old custom to have a kitchen cat. Let's see, what are some of the other things? I'm trying to remember. Well, certainly the Eucharist, certainly references to the Eucharist, which is either actually the Eucharist, which is either a host or a glass of wine or grapes. Some sort of reference to that. In New Mexico, in some of the New Mexican pieces, obviously it becomes a tortilla or some other food references. There are a lot of grapes just used for the motif, but not overtly referencing the Eucharist, but that certainly references the blood of Christ. What are some of the other sheep? Sheep, you know, San Pascual started as a shepherd. That was one of his first jobs. And so you will see sheep, but sheep as far as the Catholic Church also means flock, also means congregation. So there's certainly a reference there. I think because they're associated with San Pascual, and then part of when you go back down to church images and religious images in churches is that they were didactic, so that if people didn't understand the Latin Mass or didn't understand the language, they could certainly look around and be told the stories or see the stories. And so some of those key iconographic elements, whether they're New Mexican inspired or from, you know, the legacy of the Catholic Church, are in there to be intentionally recognizable, so that you see grapes and you think wine and you think the blood of Christ, to the person who's in the know, to the person who's familiar with that iconography. So I think they're intentionally incorporated. Sometimes they can be stylistic elements from the artists, but most of the artists, if not all of them, are very well read and very familiar with the core iconographic elements in retablos and things that have been passed down from paintings in Spain to prints in Mexico to retablos here in New Mexico that have been intentionally referenced and become part of that saint's iconography. So you can say, okay, grapes, Eucharist, Franciscan robe, must be San Pascual. The Marian image of La Conquistadora, but she's now Our Lady of Peace. She's been renamed because she is very New Mexican. She's in the Santa Fe Cathedral. Okay, but she's still a Marian image, so, you know, I would put San Pascual obviously in that category. I would put Santo Niño de Atocha in that category, and I would put San Isidro in that category of an interesting one of them is, you know, one of them performs miracles. He's a little child with a major shrine here. That's Santo Niño. San Isidro is agricultural saint, so he's very important to us. And then San Pascual as the culinary saint. But those three, in my opinion, and I'm sure other people would have other thoughts about this, and I'm sure there's additional, get intentionally placed and claimed as New Mexican, whereas the other saints may not as much. Sometimes Guadalupe, La Virgen de Guadalupe is put into that position, but she's not, you know, in Mexico you see her dressed in red, white, and green with the Mexican flag. You don't see that happen here with a New Mexican flag or some sort of connection, whether it's landscape or dress or what she does here. But I think it's interesting. You look at San Isidro also, who has a similar sort of backstory of being outside and being helped by angels as San Pascual does. But he also is very approachable. because he's, an everyday worker working out in the fields. And so that the religious backstory of San Isidro is also not necessarily forgotten, but not always included in depictions of him. So, but he's always in the New Mexican landscape. So I think it's a recent thing. I think it's really about identity issues and the artists placing themselves sort of in a New Mexican context on purpose. Because when you look at the colonial pieces and the colonial examples, you don't see overt references to this important sense of place that is New Mexico. You don't really see that. You see general decorative elements, but you don't see necessarily chilies hanging or, a beautiful landscape of piñones. You don't see that in the colonial pieces. That's one of the other things that's happening with Santo Niño de Atocha, was that he was always somebody here who would sometimes go out with San Isidro to perform miracles, and he wears out his shoes. In Chimayo, you leave little shoes for Santo Niño because he's always out on the countryside performing miracles, and he wears out his shoes. Well, now there's images that he's helping people across the border and wearing out his shoes or giving them shoes. So he's transforming in the Southwest. That image that was so beloved in Zacatecas and New Mexico is now being represented as a border saint with immigration and illegal immigration. And so, the artists are addressing those things. They realize that there are connections and that the powers of the saints change or adapt to what's going on in the current climate. So it's fascinating to watch. It's really fascinating. For a non-artist, it's really fascinating to watch how this plays out. And I always think that artists sort of lead the path for thinking, that they are able to represent, thoughts that people are beginning to boil up or the popular consciousness before we actually articulate it.